Hello, and welcome to Khorne's Guide to Domination. So today we're going to be taking a quick look at the Khorne rosters, seeing all the units, how they really play in Domination, what I think they provide to your armies, and when you should include them. After that, we'll take a look at a couple of replays to show some examples of how Khorne plays on the field. So, as you may have guessed, this video is primarily geared towards Domination mode, though this information could help you out in land battles or campaign as well. So, let's get started. First off, Lords. For Khorne, there's really only one Lord you ever see in competitive play, and that is Valkia the Bloody. Valkia is exceptionally strong for a couple of reasons. Her Spear Sleipnir is the closest thing that Khorne has to any real magic, which really helps them hedge against things like elite infantry builds. Khorne doesn't have any real blob punishment outside of this. They don't have access to things like Pit of Shades or any other spells like that, so having access to this really does hedge against something that they can otherwise be caught off guard with, so it's extremely valuable for Khorne, as well as being able to punch a hole in your opponent's front line very quickly, allow you to compromise their exposed missile line. On top of that, she's an exceptionally strong duelist, especially with the Demon Shield. A trick you'll very often see high-level Khorne players do is they'll take Valkia and go fight a big enemy lord, a Be'lakor, a Malekith, something like that. They'll pop the Demon Shield, get a few good hits in, and then run away before she actually takes any damage, basically getting you a free couple of hits in on your opponent's Lord, which can be incredibly valuable. So, Skarbrand is just a little bit too expensive for what he does. He's an okay duelist, he's fairly mobile, but he's just incredibly expensive. Even when you take off all his kit, he's still 2600, and he's still just a massive target, so he's just a little behind and a little overpriced. Same with the big Demon Lords. If you need a source of terror, this guy isn't bad. If you could just strip him down, get him for 2100, he's, I think, the cheapest source of terror you have available on your roster, which is kind of pathetic. Actually, I think the Soul Grinder's a little cheaper, but Soul Grinder's just terrible. The Herald's okay. Revelant Slaughter and Locust of Wrath have some nice melee attack buffs if you really want to buff up your blobs, but it's hard to really find a reason not to bring Valkia. On to Heroes. Heroes as well is another one that you really only see one of, and that is the Cultist of Khorne. You typically see them stripped down with just the Gate of Khorne, their summon, and they are a really nice disruption tool. On foot they have silver shields as well as respectable melee stats, so they can just go in and grind with the front line and charge up that summon, which they can then drop either on the back line to compromise some missiles, or to kill that pesky front line armor unit that you just can't chew through otherwise. So against missile factions, they can be a really nice disruption piece, or against heavily armored factions if you really need that hitting power from the Bloodletters, but don't really want to actually summon a regular Bloodletter that could be abused by missiles. On to Infantry, and you have plenty of good choices to choose from. Both Marauder variants are quite solid. The basic shielded one is nice, it's just a cheap front line. You'll bring these in pretty much every matchup. And then the dual weapons are a nice option if you need something that's a little heavier hitting, though they are fairly squishy with only 17 melee defense, so you gotta make sure to get them into the right engagements. Khorne Forsaken are kind of sad as far as Forsaken are concerned. Forsaken already have Frenzy, so they really don't gain a whole lot from the Mark of Khorne other than spell resist, but they still lose the melee defense. So compared to the other Forsaken, they are a little cheaper, but they're incredibly squishy to make up for it. So you really gotta make sure they're in the right engagement if you have a desire to bring them. Generally you can skip out on them, but they are a nice fast reinforcement if you do need that fast armored infantry in the late game. Bloodletters are not the greatest. They are your only AP option, so sometimes they're tempting, but they're not very tanky. They only have 8,000 hit points, very little armor, very little melee defense, which just makes them quite abusable to a lot of things. A lot of cheaper infantry will trade up into them, missiles will tear them apart. The only time they really pay for themselves is against tanky armored infantry, and even then they don't trade that well, so you usually want to skip out on these guys, unfortunately. Chaos Warriors. These guys are your bread and butter. They make up the bulk of your forces, and they are quite tanky, as well as just very well statted. So they make up an excellent force for just grinding through the front line. Shielded Chaos Warriors are very popular, as the silver shields provide them a lot of durability against missiles, which are Khorne's biggest weakness, generally speaking. They have very few missiles of their own, so they're often kited or boxed against, so having those shields makes them very durable, on top of augmenting their already impressive melee stats. Halberds, they're your anti-large AP option, not a lot to say there. they're a solid all-around anti-large armored unit. Dual weapons. I find dual weapons to usually be unnecessary. They're quite expensive compared to the basic ones, and their stats don't really get a whole lot for that price. They get some good weapon strength, they get some good charge bonus, they get some bonus for infantry, but 1,000 gold for an infantry unit is just a lot to be paying, in my mind. Especially when you have better options for that anti-infantry role, which we'll get to later. Brutes of the Hound kind of fall in the same category as the Chaos Warriors of Khorne, with the exception they are a lot squishier. They don't have that 110 armor, they're only 15 armor. They have really nice melee stats, they hit pretty hard, but so does pretty much everything else in your roster, so you're not really hurting for the anti-infantry department, so these guys are usually better left behind. Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne. These guys actually perform very, very well in melee. They hit like trucks, they're just lawnmowers through their infantry, but they have the same flaws as the basic Bloodletters in that they're still exploitable to missiles and magic. Even though they have spell resist and physical resist, they still get torn apart. But if you can get them into that ideal melee engagement, they will absolutely tear apart even elite infantry. They have very, very nice melee stat line, so they can actually absolutely tear things apart, but you usually don't want to start them. If you want to bring these guys, you usually bring them in your reinforcements so that you can bring them out when the time is right. You don't want them out early when they're going to get shot to pieces or hit with the Pit of Shades or anything like that. So these guys can be nice in certain scenarios, but I wouldn't bring them all the time. And if I am bringing a big AP infantry unit, I will bring these guys over the basic Bloodletters, but there's something else that's usually even better at that job that we will get to a little bit later. Now we're getting to the point of these units, both Chosen and the RR Exalted Bloodletter, they're incredibly expensive, and they're just going to eat a spell usually. They're going to get a Pit of Shades dropped on them, a Talons of the Night, whatever, and they're just going to get deleted, and your opponent's going to farm a lot of value. So they tend to just be a liability, unfortunately, because they're really cool. Moving on to Cavalry and Chariots. Not a lot to say here. You don't see a lot of these in competitive play. Chariots aren't in a great spot right now in general for any roster, so these guys are often skipped out on. The basic ones can be a nice disruption tool. Just get in the back line, be annoying and hard to kill. Because they do have the ability to punch their front line and just get on top of missile units, but generally you do leave them at home because you have better tools for the job. Occasionally you'll see a basic Chaos Knight. Chaos Knight with Lances are generally just a downgrade. They just lose out on a ton of melee defense, which is one of the things that makes basic Chaos Knights very, very good. Against factions without a lot of armor piercing, so like High Elves or Wood Elves, these guys can actually be a real terror. That heavy-hitting, mobile, heavily armored unit can be a real problem for some factions to deal with. But you gotta be very careful with them as they are quite expensive, and they can fall prey to things like AP missiles or spells. As for the unique elite Khorne Cav, these guys just kind of underperform compared to the basic Chaos Knights. They are AP, they are anti-infantry, they have magic attacks, but they crumble pretty early, and the low model count actually means they tend to connect fewer attacks in melee. Whereas with the Chaos Knight, you have 60 models connecting in melee, that's 60 attacks, so they can actually leverage that lower weapon strength more often and get more damage out than these guys can. If you're really desperate for AP, sure, but Khorne isn't often that desperate because of a certain unit that we will get to in a moment. Same goes for Skull Crushers. They're elite anti-large, but they're kind of overshadowed by a certain unit that we will get to momentarily. Marauder Horsemen of Khorne. These guys are fantastic. They're your only missile unit that's, well, one of only 2 missile units. They have AP missiles that are very, very good for killing those elite infantry units that you don't have a whole lot of other answers to. Things like Blackguard, Phoenix Guard, any of those elite halberd units that can be a real pain for you. These guys can just sit back and shoot at, as well as having really impressive melee stats for Skirmish Cav. They have 40 weapon strength and a bonus for his infantry and frenzy. So they're up at like 37 melee attack. So it's actually really, really nice for cycle charging lightning armored infantry or just sitting and throwing into heavier targets. Infantry, single entities, they're very good at tearing them apart. So these guys are actually a really versatile unit and are included in a lot of Khorne builds. A lot of the time they're brought in reinforcement as they aren't necessarily universal and they do tend to lose skirmish fights because axes travel very, very slowly. So you don't really want them fighting enemy skirmishers. But once the enemy missiles are off the field, these guys can really come in and get a lot of damage and a lot of value. or against factions like Vampire Counts or Beastmen that don't have a lot of missiles, they can be an absolute terror. These guys are excellent. Alright, monsters and beasts. This is where Khorne's bread is buttered. Chaos Warhounds are kind of shit. Their leadership is terrible. Their melee stats are underwhelming. They're fast. They have infantry capture weight, but generally pretty underwhelming for 450. Chaos Furies are your big air control tool. They're alright. They do quite well into other flying units generally, things like Gyrocopters or Screamers of Tzeentch, but they won't really kill any elite units for you. And they're alright for going after missile units, though you need to be careful not to summon too many of them, as they do tend to die out very, very quickly. And the big boys, Fleshhounds. If you've ever played as or against Khorne, you've probably seen a lot of these guys. And there's a reason. Every Khorne player brings 4 of these guys in every build. These are the best mobility unit in the game at the moment. They are good against infantry, they're good against cavalry, they're good against single entities. They are Khorne's bread and butter. They are what makes Khorne so strong, in part. Yeah. I don't know what else to say. Don't throw them into halberds, and they'll kill pretty much everything else. They're exceptional. Yeah. They're the best. You bring 4 in reserve in every single game. Chaos Spawn. Chaos Spawn of Khorne are actually pretty good. Unfortunately, they suffer from a bug. If you have these guys in your reinforcements, they will not receive their frenzy. This is a bug with all unbreakable units that have frenzy, which is basically these guys, an ROR lizard unit, and flagellants for the Empire. They don't get their frenzy if they're in reinforcements, so you have to start them, which hurts them quite a bit, because oftentimes you won't be starting large amounts of infantry with Khorne, so it's kind of hard to justify these guys a lot of the time, especially when you have the next unit, Minotaurs of Khorne. This is the other unit, aside from Fleshhounds, that have carved out a place in the meta for Khorne. Minotaurs, both variants, are just incredibly strong right now. Monstrous Infantry are probably the best unit type in the game, and these are some of the best in the game. For only 1300, they have a very impressive stat line on top of Frenzy, Blood Greed, which gives them more and more melee stats, as well as good spell resist and just good bones for infantry or bones for large, respectively. Pretty straightforward. If you need to kill infantry, you bring the anti-infantry one. If you need to kill large, you bring the anti-large one. Not a whole lot to it. These guys are really, really good for augmenting your front line. They're best paired with Marauders or Chaos Warriors, stack them on top of each other, just like any other monstrous infantry. And they're absolute unholy terrors. They're incredibly tanky, with 70 armor, makes them even better than the Beastmen Minotaurs. They're very, very hard to kill. They have good leadership. They hit like a truck. This is another unit you'll see in pretty much every matchup for Khorne. You usually bring, 2 or 3 of them in reserve. Most times you bring multiple. You bring a couple of each type to give you some options. They are absolute linebackers and will tear through enemy infantry or anything large. You'll notice I skipped a unit. That's because this unit is complete garbage and doesn't exist. Don't use this thing. Chaos Warshrine of Khorne. It gives good leadership buffs. It gives like plus 18 leadership, just like every other Warshrine, but its unique effect is pretty terrible. It's up to plus 8 melee attack and 15% weapon strength, AP and non-AP. But it takes so long to charge. It takes, I think, 200 entity deaths nearby to charge it up. So by the time it takes effect, a large part of the fight has already been decided. And it's not like you can drop a spell to just instantly get all those kills to charge it up. And even once it's charged up, the buffs are really underwhelming. Like 15% weapon strength and 8 melee attack. For Khorne Warriors, 50% weapon strength is like, like 4 or 5 weapon strength? That's incredibly underwhelming for a 1300 gold unit. Like, you'd just rather have a Minotaur or like 3 or 4 Marauders. Like, this thing's just incredibly terrible. Soul Grinder. So this is the cheapest Terra source, and that's the only reason you would ever bring it, and even then, it's not a very compelling option. It is technically a missile monster, but the missile is incredibly unwieldy. You can't target the missile attack. You can only give it melee attack orders, which it will shoot whatever you're melee attacking. But basically, if you want to target the missile attack, you have to give it an attack order. It charges, fires while it's charging, and you got to pull it back and do it again. And it's just very, very micro-intensive. And the missile attack isn't even that good. It's a shotgun blast, it's multiple pellets, and it's incredibly inaccurate, so it almost never gets its damage back. It's just really underwhelming. The missile sucks, and if you want a melee monster, well, you have better options. So, yeah, you usually want to skip out on these guys. Bloodthirsters, and by extension, Khorne's Bloody Fist. These guys are just really, really expensive. Large singularities like this are pretty niche in Domination these days. They have a place sometimes, but generally, if you want that, you have Valkia as your anti-large duelist, and she's quite good at that job. I mean, comparing their stat line, Valkia, who you usually take with, just Spear and Demon Shield, she has arguably a better stat line. Well, she has less HP. She's a little weaker, but she has the Demon Shield to make up for it, as well as being really quick and nimble and hard to shoot. And she's just a really good duelist, and is usually all you need, and you usually bring her anyway, so there's not a lot of reason to bring the Bloodthirster. Unless you're really desperate for terror, which Khorne doesn't usually need, so... I don't know. There's some niche application if you really need to punish an enemy single entity, if you're really trying to get in that duel, but those duels aren't usually super decisive in Domination. And last but not least for this category is the Bloodbrute Behemoth. Kind of falls in the same position as the Bloodthirsters. This guy's a little better because he is on the ground, so he does actually have capture weight, as well as just being a better fighter overall. He does have really good stat line, as well as healing, which is a big plus for all single entities. Percentage-based healing, when you have a health pool this big, gives you a ton of healing back, as well as just having a massive AP open profile. But he is very expensive, so if you bring him, you gotta have a very good reason to do so. He can be an absolute terror if you have single entities to kill, maybe against vampire counts, you want to go kill those corpse carts, you want to kill crypt horrors, things like that. But it's a very big price tag, so if you bring this guy, you want to have a very good reason to do so. Artillery and war machines. Blood Shrine of Khorne is kind of niche. It has some nice melee attack buffs. It has Totem of Endless Bloodletting, 8 melee attack, 4 leadership to all allies in range. Just permanently, doesn't even need to be in melee. As well as Encourage, so that's 12 leadership overall, and my game crashed. Come on, game, don't crash on me. Alright, well, while we relaunch the game real quick, yeah. Blood Shrine, it's kind of niche. Most of the time you'd rather just have another infantry unit, but it's okay. The aura isn't super large. You can only have it affecting a couple of units. And the buffs aren't impactful enough that it's really going to be better than just having another unit or two. So typically you skip out on it, though it can be a nice disruption piece if you're really desperate for one. But you have some other nice options, so you don't really need it. After that we have the Skull Cannon, which is kind of a piece of shit, I'll be honest. It's kind of a piece of shit. It's an artillery piece. It's mobile. It's a chariot. Doubles as a chariot, but it has very, very little ammo, and it's wildly inaccurate. You have to be at like half of its max range to have a chance of hitting your shots, and even then, it doesn't hit that hard. It really relies on its ability to regen ammo in melee to get its value. The idea is you fire your shots, you go into melee, you get some more shots, you back out, you fire again, which is a time-consuming and micro-consuming process, and there's just not a lot of payout for that little mini-game you have to play to actually get the damage off. So for 1100, some people have had some success using these guys to counterfire skirmish cav, which can be a counter to Khorne. It's just good skirmish play, but generally I find them to be too expensive for the job, for the damage they do. So I typically skip out on them. So, all in all, typical Khorne army comps look something like this. You got Valkia, you take her nice and cheap. You only bring the Demon Shield when you have a single entity to duel. Maybe you're fighting a Be'lakor or a Malekith, something like that. A lot of the time you can skip it, though, and just take her for 1500, which is a nice price point to have her at. And then, if you need a Cultist, you bring a Cultist with just Gate. And then you get your Marauders, get some Chaos Warriors, get some dual weapons. And Ren doesn't exactly work, but that's the general idea. You get your Minotaurs of whatever type you need. Think 3. And this is a pretty generic idea of a Khorne build. You start a nice bunch of infantry, then you reinforce it with Minotaurs and Fleshhounds as the game goes on. And let's see some live examples of that. Well, not live, I suppose. These are replays. First one we have is assaulting a box against dwarves. And you'll see I have basically the same thing we just had in build, except I have a Minotaur in my starter, a couple of Chaos Warriors in my reserve instead, I believe. And the nice thing about Khorne is that it is fairly straightforward. The Khorne really does one thing, and they do it really well. They get in there and they fight. They just get in melee, they grind, they do that job very, very well. So it's a pretty straightforward playstyle. It's kind of similar to all the other Rush factions, you know, things like Norriska, Warriors of Chaos, so it's a very transferable skill set, which makes Khorne a nice faction if you're just starting to learn to play the multiplayer, because it does teach you those fundamentals that can apply to many other factions as well. So, as soon as this loads in, we'll get into general playstyle against a box faction like Dwarves we have here. And shout out to RTK Dragons for helping me record these, by the way. So, big thing with Khorne is to be very, very patient. You don't need to engage too early. You want to make sure you're engaging on your terms. So right here, we're taking this whole right side, and let me get my my drawing tool over here real quick. So yeah, Dwarves want to set up on the hill over here. We're perfectly happy to let them as we take the rest of the map. My pen is not working. Why is my pen not working? Gosh darn it, my pen. Okay, well, I guess we'll be doing this without the pen. What a shame. So yeah, you just wrap around the side. We take position all the way up to here. Up as far as we can go. And this gives us a nice surround for when we want to engage on the Dwarves. We'll be able to engage from this side, going into their flank over here, as well as engaging into them head-on from our deployment zone. So generally you want to push up as many forces as you can to get around the side, and then you can summon in forces whenever you're ready to attack them from your main zone, but we don't need to attack them yet. The points aren't open, and once the point's open, we'll have our cultist just capture this one. He just tips his toe on the point, and now the Dwarves have to come forward. If we engage on them where they are, well, they're right in their spawn. They're kind of, you know, right up against the white line. It's kind of hard to attack them. So now we make them come forward. They come out of their little hole, and we can get a better surround. We can get around the side over here. We can get around the side over here now a little bit better, and they're further from the reinforcements. So now that they've come forward a little bit, now they're starting to shoot at us. Now we've decided it's time to go in. So we start going. We try to get everything to attack all at once. A really easy trick is to just select all of your troops, like, you know, click and drag, then hold Alt and move them all forward. Good nice spear down the front line. You always want to drop spear on the front line when you can, so that way you weaken the front line, you can just get your melee troops in the back line quickly. If you drop a spear on a missile unit, then it'll survive almost always. If you drop a spear in the front line, well then your melee units get in the back line, and now that missile unit's never going to be allowed to fire again. Your cultist in here, he's just farming up his summon. And then we just got everything collapsing on the other side. We got our Minotaurs just punching through the front line, and they can oftentimes just pull straight through these miners and these warriors straight into the crossbows and just shut them down. You need to be a little careful of things like Slayers or whatever any other peeling units your opponent has. Yeah, they're just running right through. They're saying, nope, you're not allowed to shoot me. Get right in there in the back line. And now that the Dwarves are like pulled apart, they have to defend against all these different points. We found what we want. We found a hole in their lines. So now we got Marauders coming up and Flesh Hounds. They're going right into this hole, and now look, there's a juicy Quarreler right here. They can come right through the hole, they can back up these Minotaurs, and now we're in the cookie jar. The Dwarves are spread thin, they have to engage all our melee units, and we found our way into the back line. And now these Flesh Hounds are just going to be able to go ham. Kill these Quarrelers, move on to other Quarrelers, they'll tear them apart. Now the Cultist has also got in the back line. He's a nice disruption piece. He's going to send these Quarrelers. And if Thoric wants to come peel him, well, Valky is happy to take that 2v1. And now Thoric is in a bad spot. Our Minotaurs are routing up, but that's fine, because they did their job. They got the Quarrelers shut down long enough for our front line to start grinding out and winning out, and our Flesh Hounds to find that hole and get in these back line. And then from there you grind it out. You just start bringing more and more infantry, more Flesh Hounds, and just start pouring through the holes, and the Dwarves won't be able to actually reinforce in time. So yeah, that's the general game plan against a box. Now, what will often happen against Khorne, though, because they're so good in melee, is that your opponent knows they can't have a stationary position like that, so they'll kite you. So we have another replay right here of playing Khorne into kite, which is a little more tricky play style, a little more nuanced, and requires a little more heads-up gameplay. So this is a game between myself and Houseplant. We'll actually be watching Houseplant playing Khorne, so he is the master himself. So if there's anybody to learn from, he's your man. So, the big thing to be aware of against Kite is that you can't negate all of their damage. they're going to be able to shoot something, so you want to make sure that they're shooting the least valuable thing you have available. As Khorne, that's going to be your shielded marauders. They're only 425, they have shields, they're not going to be taking a whole lot of damage from the shooting, so you'll make sure that that's what your opponent's shooting, not your more expensive warriors or minotaurs. So let's see how Houseplant does this. So if we just zoom out, let's actually put unit highlights on this so we can see everything. So as we see here, he's got his marauders up front, he's got his warriors in the back, and he's got his minotaurs off to the side. There's not really anything in the area to shoot them, and then they can just fall back behind the lines as soon as something does show up. Scourge Runners come up, immediately going for the Minotaurs. He'll pull the Minotaurs back. He'll screen with Valkia. Valkia is really, really good for this because she's so small. Your opponents can often waste a lot of shots. And this is the tactic I was talking about before. He goes in, he takes a fight with Malekith, and immediately pops the Demon Shield. He gets a few good hits in on Malekith, and then as soon as the Demon Shield goes away, yeah, Malekith pulls out because he doesn't want to hit Valkia's Demon Shield, and she backs off as well. And because Valkia is such a small target, she can often waste a lot of your opponent's ammo, like I was saying. Now, these Scourgers are coming up and trying to get cheeky shots in, so Fleshhounds come in, and notice how the Fleshhounds don't go straight for the Scourge Runners. They go to try and cut them off. They try to head them off here. Can you see my cursor? Yes, you can. So they try to head them off, and then only once they get closer do they actually turn to actually attack the Scourge Runners. Now the Scourge Runners have to flee, and he doesn't over-pursue. You want to keep your Fleshhounds close. Just keep them behind your lines, and make sure your opponent can't actually run over your lines with things like Chariots or any of those skirmishers too much, and just chasing the skirmish chariots away, absorbing shots from Black Arc Corsair handbows because Fleshhounds aren't taking a ton of damage. They have decent armor, fizz resist, and they are pretty spread out, so they aren't taking a ton of damage. All the while, the infantry line is advancing, taking a bit of damage, but like I said, these are cheap marauders. It doesn't really matter if they take a ton of damage. The Chaos Warriors are enduring pretty well. Now the Fleshhounds are just keeping those skirmish elements distracted, keeping them off, and the infantry line just keeps advancing. They'll force the Dark Elves back and back and back until they're eventually forced to see their objective. And now, the Chariots try to get cheeky, try to get in the melee. The Fleshhounds come in and punish it. Valky's coming over as well. And now the Warriors just pushing up and pushing up, all the while holding the side objective with a large contingent, so his opponent can't actually get on. And yeah, that's the plan. That's the general game plan. You just keep your infantry moving forward slowly while you have your Fleshhounds and your Minotaurs ready to punish anything that's really trying to get on top of you. Now, these Cold Knights are a little bit tricky for him to deal with because they are the one thing that can actually deal with the Fleshhounds or the Minotaurs in melee. But, he just plays around them well. He keeps his Minotaurs with his infantry, keeps his Fleshhounds away from them, and just tries to punish whatever his opponent gets too aggressive with. Yeah, that is that. Now, there is one final point of Khorne play that we must discuss before we end the video. So if we just get back to the army builder real quick, the most important part of any faction is choosing the correct banner. And for Khorne, there's only a few options. So for Khorne, you have your basic bitch banner. The yellow's ugly, the red it's thematic, but the yellow is terrible, so you can't use the basic bitch banner anyway because it shows your basic bitch, and you can't be having that, especially in tournament play. You got to represent. So you got a couple of good options. The first good option is the Crimson Skull. Black on red, it's a classic combo. This is the OG Khorne banner. It's been in the game since launch. It's A tier, if not S tier. These ones kind of suck. Brazen Throne, just kind of bland, kind of pale. You can't really see the design, so kind of meh. Bloody Sword, again, the yellow's kind of gross. The red's okay, but it's a little overpowering in this one. Karnath's Sun, just, yellow with some black lines. You can't even tell what that design is. It's too small. No, we're not about it. This is the good one, Bloodkeepers. Again, red and black, classic combo. You got the Khorne red. It's the S tier Khorne banner. If you want to show up in tournaments, this is the way to go. Style on your opponents. And that's it for Khorne. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you appreciate it, found it helpful, had any questions, please like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. I will be trying to get some more guides coming out soon, but I have been having some trouble recording lately. As you saw, it's crashing on me a bunch, so try to fix that, try to get some more guides out. Thank you guys so much. I will see you next time.